Well, I think that sets up the issue quite nicely. So I'm Patrick McWhorter, President and CEO of the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits. We'll wait for the technology to catch up. There we go. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about why this matters to nonprofit leaders, building on what you heard in the video, and in particular to talk about the opportunity that the federal government actually provided to us. Believe it or not, the federal government did something helpful to us in 2014 through the Office of Management and Budget. So let me begin with, this was a tweet, or some, I don't know, they tweeted it, they Facebooked it, I don't do half the social media stuff, but our staff does. And this was actually created for us by the National Council of Nonprofits. I'll give you a moment to read it, so kind of get the concept. But you probably wouldn't want to have gone to a cookout this summer with the hot dogs and hamburgers served having been cooked on the grill with no charcoal. And that's kind of what it's like running a nonprofit without overhead. It's very hard to deliver the program. So I highlight this because this was actually the most retweeted, reposted, whatever they do in social media that we had all year at the Alliance. This clearly resonated with our members. And I wasn't surprised because 10 years ago, and we're celebrating our 10th anniversary year at the Alliance this year, when I first started and I would travel around the state and people would ask, what are you going to do at the Alliance? I said, well, what do you want us to do? One of the most common things I would hear from nonprofit leaders is, help us get support for operating expenses. It's so hard to do that. And so here 10 years later, we have the opportunity, and this dialogue today is a great opportunity to do that. It only took us 10 years to get here. But many have been blazing the trail and helping us think about this. And I know in the information you were sent ahead of time, the information on the website about this program, there were some readings. I don't know if you had a chance to go check them out. One of them was some excerpts from this article, or of course you can read the entire article, that really I think started this conversation. Much of what you're seeing today, of course these issues have been around for a long time, but were framed very well in the Stanford Social Innovation Review article in the fall of 2009 by Ann Goggins-Gregory and Don Howard. And what they defined in this article is what they call the starvation cycle. And the starvation cycle is one in which there is a perception and a misunderstanding about the real cost of running a nonprofit program. And that comes from funders' expectations. Now, to be fair, funders here is not necessarily those of you in this room, it might be, but it includes individuals. There's a cultural norm around this as well. Just to share a brief story from Thanksgiving, update my cookout season. I was visiting family in Atlanta. My father-in-law was there, and he was talking about how proud he was of a ranch for children with disabilities in Montana that he has begun supporting. He's retired now, and he's starting to put more and more resources into philanthropy. He's a retired truck driver, by the way, so it's not like he's an uber wealthy person. But he and has already talked about putting, probably creating a charitable remainder trust for this ranch. Wonderful to hear him talk about this. He's been known throughout his life for buying boats and planes and flying toys and things like that. So this is wonderful. But at the same time that he was telling some people at the table about this, he emphasized that why he loves this organization so much is because they put 93% of their dollars directly into program. They pay some salaries, but they don't pay very much. I'm pretty sure they're very low. Now, I suspect what I do know about organizations that serve people with disabilities, that a significant percentage of the cost of that organization is in salaries. That's a good deal of the cost of providing that type of service. I could go look at the $990 for his organization. I'm sure I would find that. But he, as now what he considers a major donor of this organization, doesn't necessarily understand all the salaries are not in that 7%. And what has the Special K Ranch in Montana been telling their donors about this 93%? So this is real. This is out there, I think, in our culture. And then, of course, what happens is Well, then because we tell you put all of our money into a program, then that's all you fund, and then we don't put money into infrastructure, and then it basically is a cycle that perpetuates itself. And what the authors of the article identified was a process by which ultimately this starves the organization of critical infrastructure they need to be able to be effective, to scale their programs or have the most impact on their mission. Even the very measurement of their impact is overhead, requires overhead, right? To measure, to collect data, to report it and analyze it and report it. So let's now take a brief moment though to ask the question what overhead is. And this, I will get into the OMB discussion in a moment, but I will tell you that there are actually a lot of terms that we tend to use. And I'm just picked out 3 because you can begin to see why this actually becomes kind of a hairy issue, and I think, Helen, you set it up very well. It's not as simple as an issue as some people like to make it. So I told you that nonprofit leaders told me they wanted more support for operating funds, operating expenses. Then we have this term overhead, and then there's something called indirect costs. And I'm leaving out things like administrative expenses, management in general. So the first thing to understand is, even when you're running a nonprofit, knowing whether you're talking about any one of these things and what you're talking about at any given time is not such a simple thing. So let me tell you what my version is. But again, this is not cut and dry. And we'll show you a chart a little bit later about how even within the supposedly rule-based world of federal funding, it's not that simple. But I would say that in general, operating funds are those dollars that you need in order just to operate your program. They're not the program dollars itself, but they're just what you need in order to support everything else that you do. That's usually what people mean when they say operating. Now, how they allocate their funds and how they define it, that's a whole nother matter. But overhead is probably the same as operating funds, but when you get into conversations with people about it, sometimes they do not want to include fundraising expenses. Sometimes they do. So overhead is quite frankly a very fuzzy concept, and that's why I prefer that we use actually some of these other terms to be a little more precise. Indirect cost is often a very specific formula-driven, rule-based concept, mostly within federal, state, and local grants and contracts with nonprofits. So even when we start out with the concept of overhead, we all already get a bit mushy when we talk about the words. So the National Council of Nonprofits, so you know briefly who they are. We're the alliance here in Arizona. There are 38 states with a state association of nonprofits, and most of us belong to the National Council of Nonprofits, and our members do. It's 26,000 nonprofits across the country that through this network, we work on all kinds of issues together. We share what's going on across state lines. We focus some on some federal issues, although frankly, Congress doesn't do much these days. So most of the action's in the states, and it's what we share with one another about what's going on in the states where we spend most of our time. 5 years ago, the National Council of Nonprofits had the opportunity to start looking at issues with government grants and contracts, a variety of issues. In fact, their first issue that they were studying was late payments on grants and contracts. Now, that is an issue, some places more than others, but as it turns out, that wasn't the most significant issue. The most significant issues were around the complexity of processes in government grants and contracts, with changing terms of contracts that have ultimately probably affected the bottom line of the nonprofit, and not paying the full cost of services. And in Arizona, that was actually the #1 issue. So the data that was gathered first in 2010 and then updated in 2013 by the National Council of Nonprofits actually take a look at these issues. This is actually from the 2013 data. I know you don't have time to study this in detail here. I think we're going to probably share the PowerPoint later. But I will tell you that right there at the top is the payments do not cover the full cost of contracted services. Half of organizations in Arizona reported that this is a problem. Now, these are organizations with government grants and contracts. This is not including organizations that do not have government funding. And 28% said that this was a big problem for them. I can tell you that nationally, We are talking about, just in federal dollars, roughly $300 billion in grants and contracts, that based upon the national survey of not covering the full cost, we're talking about a scale of somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 billion that is essentially not being funded. In Arizona, we can extrapolate from that. We didn't get into precise figures in this survey, but from that national figure, we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million. Now, foundations here are giving around $1 billion. Individuals are giving about $3 billion. $300 million is significant dollars in the state of Arizona. And then the anecdotal version of this came from a pulse poll survey we did in conjunction with the National Council survey. These are just some examples. School lunch program where the cost is $1.85 per meal and they get 82 cents. Zero overhead for a new state grant for homeless services. Capped administrative expenses. On average, nonprofits said when they were getting overhead, and only half of them were getting overhead at all in the grants and contracts, the average was they were getting 7%. There we go. So, with these data, the National Council of Nonprofits started talking with folks nationally. That's actually how they met Fred along the way. But in particular in the federal government, because the Office of Management and Budget was taking a look at some rules that govern grants and contracts across the federal government. So some of you may be familiar with all the many, if you're in the finance area especially, the many circulars that nonprofits live by, OMB 122, OMB 123, etc. There are actually 8 of them. The OMB was going through a process of streamlining those. So there was a lot that they were taking a look at in this streamlining of these rules. These are basically all the rules that the OMB gives to the federal agencies that write grants and contracts to nonprofits. And they were essentially saying we're going to create one Uber circular that streamlines all of that. So that's all good for us, good sort of regulatory reform. Well, one of the issues embedded within that overall OMB circular change was indirect costs. So now we're talking specifically about this term indirect costs, because that's what they use in the federal government that we call, in general, overhead. So the National Council of Nonprofits had the opportunity to speak with the OMB, to testify to the OMB hearings and share the data from their national study. And in that process, they were able to get a revision to the rule. And this is in essence a rule. It's called a circular, but it's a guidance technically. But as far as we're all concerned, it's a rule. The federal agencies have to follow it. Now we got basically a rule included that says that if there is indirect cost in a federal grant or contract, it needs to ultimately fund the program down at the provider level. And in a moment I'll explain to you why that was needed, what was changing. But let me actually say why this is so significant. How much of all the funding for nonprofits, I have a little quiz for you here, how much of all the funding for nonprofits, the ratio, comes from government sources, federal, state, local dollars? What percentage would you say?
30%.
58?
10.
10? 30? I knew Marissa, you've heard this so many times. 32%. 32% of all the resources available to nonprofits comes between grants and contracts, federal, state, and local sources combined. Now, of that 32%, the largest by far is the federal government. So what you have is the largest single funder, if we think of the federal government as one funder, of nonprofits declaring that indirect cost is real and it should be funded. Now think about how different that is than my father-in-law at the Thanksgiving table. So we have called this a game changer. We have said this is a game-changing moment for our sector. Now, of course, when we talk with nonprofits, we have to remember they are not all getting government grants contracts. By the way, your 58% wasn't that far off. About 60% of human services funding comes from grants and contracts. And healthcare, very high percentage, of course. And then in other areas, not so much, right? So you have to talk with all nonprofits about how does this impact you? And what we share with nonprofits who are not getting government grants or contracts, this matters to you as well, for a number of reasons. One, Ellen's already alluded to. The watchdogs have been using this overhead concept as a measure of effectiveness for too long. And the good news is the overhead myth started to change the conversation. In fact, the quote directly from the first letter, which was a letter to all of you, from the overhead myth group. So the overhead myth, this was 3 of the major data and watchdog groups at a national level. Charity Navigator, Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance, and GuideStar. They came together and they wrote this letter that said, among many things, well, they said, we write to correct a misconception about what matters when deciding which charity to support. The percent of charity expenses that go to administrative and fundraising costs, commonly referred to as overhead, is a poor measure of a charity's performance. So this was big. This was the summer of 2013. And now I will tell you that everybody asks next, so what should we be looking at? And they don't have the answer either. So, I mean, that's really where the conversation begins. What are the measures that we can look at to compare one organization to another? So that there's a lot of work still to be done, I think, in that area. But at least we begin trying to break down this notion that how much you spend on overhead is somehow a measure of effectiveness in and of itself. Why else should this matter to you if you're a nonprofit? So it matters because these watchdogs are influencing how donors, individuals, and anybody who uses them as a way to evaluate nonprofits think about this. But then also, because out there in the competitive world of fundraising, when, again, well, I'll use the Arizona figure, when you have essentially $300 million that is not being covered through just the federal grants and contracts, okay? And we don't even know what the figure is for the state and local part. Remember that quote, you know, the new state homeless grant with no overhead, okay? So where did the nonprofits get those dollars? I mean, they still provide the services. So I still have the grant, I still have the contract that says I'm going to provide services to 100 kids, or 1,000 meals are going to be served, whatever it is. And I'm not getting the full cost covered. Where do I go for it? You all know where they go. Okay, they are going to all of you, they are going to individual donors, they're going to wherever else they can. And of course, then we start feeding the starvation cycle when those costs are not covered. And keep in mind, human services. There is a huge part of the work that nonprofits do in the human services that they got into because the federal government decentralized many of these programs starting 30 years ago. So and Arizona especially has embraced that decentralization. That's why we have so many nonprofits here. It's one reason. We have a very entrepreneurial culture, so we have a lot of nonprofits that really believe that, or people that believe that delivering these services directly through nonprofits is the way to go. It's more efficient, it's more effective. But the fact is that many of these services, they are provided because we have a public policy that says it should be funded through taxpayers. And so we have chosen nonprofits as the delivery vehicle. But we should be covering the cost of those. We as taxpayers should. So we are not getting everything that we supposedly are paying for as taxpayers when these costs are not funded. And then, of course, there's the ripple effect of all the other groups. So maybe you fund in the arts, or maybe you were, but now you're having to help some of these human services groups because the overhead's not being covered, and now the arts are getting less. And you can go on into the other parts of the sector that are affected by this as well. All right. How much time do I have? Am I doing
About 2 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, as you might imagine, this is an overview and this is awareness, so we are not getting into really detailed, messy stuff about the OMB rule here. To be honest, I'm not even the best one to do that. The National Council has been on top of this. But I do want you to understand exactly what's happening with this, what's going to happen over the next couple of months in particular. So what did the OMB do? Well, the first thing to understand is this is a diagram kind of representing how the money flows. It's kind of messy and hard to follow. But in essence, Most of the dollars we're talking about here in the nonprofit sector that are coming from federal dollars, quite frankly, are coming through state and local governments. Some of them are coming directly from federal sources, but many of the dollars, frankly, most of the ones that matter here, are going through the state and some through local governments. So the OMB passed this rule a year ago. It goes into effect on December 26th. It's the federal government's Christmas gift to the nonprofit sector. But that doesn't mean anything changes on December 27th. What happens is, after December 26th, federal agencies have a year to align their rules, their policies and procedures, their manuals, their guidelines, whatever they have, that governs these many billions of dollars of grants and contracts going out through these systems to comply with the new requirement. So what does that mean? Well, that means that first, all these agencies are going to have to implement this at the federal level. Then this comes down to the state and local level. And they have to begin then looking at how do we make sure that indirect cost that comes to us from federal funds actually ultimately gets to the provider. Most of them are not even aware of this new rule yet. The National Council of Nonprofits and some of the state associations, we're the first people who are even talking about this. You're some of the first people in Arizona hearing about this. I was in Yuma a couple of months ago, and I just made mention of this new rule going into effect in December, and there was somebody who runs the Community Development Block Grant Program at the city of Yuma, and his ears perked up, and I said, I'll talk to you in the break. And I told him what was going on. He said, do you know what we do with the 20% of funds that comes from the Community Development Block Grant, federal funds from the Housing Urban Development to the city of Yuma? That 20% funds me and everybody at the city who runs this program. Now, that 20% has to go to the providers who are actually getting grants through the city from federal funds. So the city of Yuma is going to have to change something, somewhere, somehow. How that happens? That's why the work begins after December 26th. So for the next year and beyond, but especially the next year, a lot of our work in front of us is to educate local and state governments about the rule change and to work with them. We're not here to beat them up. And we know the fiscal climate in the local and state government here. We're not expecting new dollars to start coming out of the state with this. We're going to have to figure out how can we make sure that the intent of this new federal rule actually gets implemented at the local level. By the way, this is an illustration of the complexity. Remember the fuzziness and everything? This is literally then getting into the details of what ultimately these local and state governments have to figure out, and with the many varying federal rules on what counts under overhead and what doesn't. I mean, what we do know is that by and large, fundraising costs are not included in overhead when you're talking about federal funds. So it's only other indirect costs. However, what's included and what's not varies tremendously. So there's an education process that's going to happen. And by the way, a lot of this needs to happen with nonprofits as well. We have surveyed nonprofits and found that a significant number of them, even when they have government grants and contracts, cannot tell you what if they, not complying with a particular funder, but just know what is your indirect cost ratio or what is your overhead ratio. Many of them don't know it. So we have training to do for nonprofits. We have training and advocacy to do with state and local governments, and potentially we could have advocacy at the legislative level. The state of Illinois has actually passed a law that says the state has to comply with this federal rule. I don't know if we need to do that here. Maybe we can just work with the agencies. We'll see. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. This is just the beginning of the path later this month when the rule goes into effect. And we hope that you will be with us in the nonprofit sector as we try to see how we can take advantage of this and begin to change the conversation around overhead. Thank you.